All right. It is the week of November 15th, 2021, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we're going to talk about UFC 268 pay-per-view buy estimates. We haven't heard anything about it. No numbers from Sports Business Journal or any other reliable sources. I'll break down why that is, as well as give you my own rough estimate of buys from the card. Then we've got the big one today, Endeavor's Q3 earnings call. Lots to unpack, a lot of highlights that focus specifically on the UFC and their revenue and costs. Very big deal today, especially with the results that came out. So we will unpack all of that here on this show. Then we've got LFA extending their partnership with UFC Fight Pass through 2025. A big deal. We'll talk about the pros and cons of that partnership, as well as is LFA really suited for Fight Pass and vice versa? Is it a good relationship or should they really look elsewhere? Deal's already done, but we'll go ahead and break down our thoughts on that as well. And then we've got PFL and Legends memorabilia, that is, entering into a exclusive merchandising partnership and Legends taking a stake in the PFL. That is a very big deal considering their third season just wrapped up and the ratings were a little iffy. I'll talk about what that means for the promotion and why the deal makes sense and how it came together. Lastly, we've got to talk about ESPN singing the high praises of the UFC, driving ESPN Plus subscriptions. Apparently, the global sports media broadcast partner of the UFC is very, very happy with what the promotion has done for their streaming platform. It's a very big deal for a lot of reasons, especially with those Q3 earnings that we'll couple with from Endeavour. It's a big business week and day for the UFC in general. So with that in mind, we'll have timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is UFC 268 pay-per-view buys. We haven't heard a word on them. Not a peep. Not from any reliable sources anyway. If you are looking at pay-per-view estimates right now, chances are they are coming from one particular site that is known for making up salaries and pay-per-view buy estimates, so you need to throw those out the window. I'm recording this early in the week, so depending on when this is released, it's possible that SBJ or another reliable source ends up putting out an estimate for 268 in that time. If that happens, then I apologize. But let's go ahead and run through this as though we're not going to get any numbers, at least anytime soon, right? Generally, that only happens when the pay-per-view not necessarily underdelivers, but it doesn't do really great numbers. That's just the way it works. ESPN, UFC wants to tout big pay-per-view buy events. It's good for their PR, it's good for them internally for morale. It's saying, hey, yeah, we crushed these numbers. If you look at, McGregor Cerrone, Disney CEO brought it up on their earnings call. And Disney just had their earnings call recently, and they've talked about the UFC and being happy with it, but, there were no mention of UFC 268 pay-per-view buys being very big, which if they had been at least in the upper echelon of good and in the very good range, would have been brought up, right? Because that is something you want to share with investors and shareholders and, reporters. You want to say like, oh, hey, here's what's going on. Considering Disney Plus is having some issues too, there would have been a big emphasis on those numbers. The fact we've heard nothing bode well, in my opinion, for pay-per-view buys. Doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but it is rare that you do not talk about pay-per-view buys in some sort of fashion if they're not good, right? Might have messed that up. It is rare that you do not talk about pay-per-view buys if they're good. That's what I meant to say. So, it was an amazing card from start to finish, right? But you got a lot of things going on still. COVID has kind of retreated in many places in the U.S. now, where we of course haven't had any lockdowns, and a lot of places have been kind of do whatever at this point. But cases have dropped significantly over the past month or so, where a lot of people probably feel safer to go out. It's pre-winter, so in a lot of places in the US it's still nice enough to go outside and do things, or it's the last type of getting outside weather without dealing with snow and all of that. That could be a lot of factors. There are reasons why this card maybe did not do as well as one might think. When you're looking in terms of draw power, right? Masvidal clearly was the A side in Masvidal versus Usman, which was reported to break around 1.3 million. I forget what the actual number came in at, but over a mil, right, or near a mil, globally, big deal, very big deal. And then you had Masvidal versus Usman 2, which came in lower than 1. I forget what the exact numbers on that were. I want to say 700K is what was reported, but again, it's been so long. I'm not 100% on that either, but I know it was lower. It kind of dropped. That was probably as a result of Masvidal losing. Usman definitely took some of Masvidal's star power when we've talked about the transitive property, right? Diaz takes McGregor's, Masvidal takes Diaz's, Usman takes Masvidal's, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that it being a rematch between Covington and Usman, despite how good that fight was, that might have turned off a lot of casual fans. They might have said, oh, he's just going to beat him again, which he did a little bit. Well, I don't know if you want to say more convincingly. I'd say yes, more convincingly, pure decision. But, that turns off casual viewers, as well as the fact that, Covington is not historically a big draw. Internally in the MMA community, he's well known, he's boisterous, he's been able to make inroads with, certain political affiliations that have garnered him attention. But if you look at his ratings for cards he's headlined outside of, the pay-per-view against Usman at 245, they haven't been spectacular. They really haven't been that good. They haven't been terrible. Well, actually, some were. I'm pretty sure his fight against Robbie Lawler was one of the lowest rated ESPN, if not the lowest rated ESPN show, although that was also at like 2 p.m. on a random weekend. It was very strange. But, he's not a giant draw. He at least through ratings and probably pay-per-view buys. He's really not. So that could be part of the factor. And then you look at the undercard. I think that's another big reason. Whaley and Rose, again, not historical big draws. They're just not. And that doesn't mean they're not awesome to watch. I mean, it's amazing. The card was fantastic. The card was awesome. If you're a hardcore fan, even if you're not a hardcore fan, watching that card, I mean, Gaethje versus Chandler, right? Boom. Fireworks. But again, in terms of the actual drawing power of those fights, you probably got some casuals converted from Gaethje and Chandler to semi-casual or more hardcore, and semi-casual and semi-hardcore to full hardcore for sure. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to bring in the casual on pay-per-viewer to watch Gaethje versus Chandler. Unfortunately not. So I would estimate that probably did around 500K, maybe 400K buys. I think it probably did well. I don't think it did exceedingly well. Otherwise, the UFC, ESPN, somebody would be touting it from the rooftop. So that's my guess as to why we haven't heard any numbers. If new numbers come out and they're higher than that, I'll be shocked. If they're around that range, 400 to 500K, that sounds about right. If they're lower, wouldn't be terribly shocked, but that would also show that Usman is not as big of a draw as a lot of people thought following his wins over Masvidal, right? This is against a opponent that they have good feud, good drama and beef with, but not necessarily a major draw in terms of ratings and buys. So we'll see if we get any numbers. If we do, it could be a long time, but my guess is it probably did around 400. I'm going to say 400K on the lower end, right? Actually, instead of 500K, I think it's probably 400K. And yeah, I just don't think Usman got as much of that drawing power as Masvidal did from being Diaz. That's how this works, unfortunately. You got to have big moments, you got to capitalize on them, and even when you have those big moments, doesn't necessarily mean it transfers over the way one might assume, right? Usman's a very dominant welterweight champion, but don't know that he's being, a big pay-per-view draw and going to reach the level of stardom as, say, an Adesanya or somebody else. So it is what it is. We'll see what the numbers are, but that's my take on it anyway. All right, now we are on to the meat and potatoes of this episode, which is the Endeavour Q3 earnings call. It was a big one this past Monday, and I mean, there's no other way to state it other than Endeavour did very, very well. And the UFC in particular was called out for how well it was doing. So Endeavour ended up posting a net income of $63.6 million, brought the company back into the black. They had been in the red last year with COVID, everything else going on. That's not surprising that they were in the red, but to come back and get that type of net income is good, to say the least. It's very, very good. Also beat Wall Street's, projections, ended up with a, revenue of 1.39 billion, where Wall Street had them at 1.3 billion. So anytime you can beat Wall Street's projections on an earnings call, always a good time. Also, as Mr. Paul Gift, our friend over at Forbes MMA Analytics on Twitter, pointed out, they raised their overall guidance $100 million or so on revenue and $70 million after EBITDA. Anytime you do that on an earnings call, stock goes up, generally. After hours trading is already up for EDR. I expect the next couple days it will go up. You never know, because Wall Street and stocks right now are all over the place with a lot of different things going on, but I would imagine this stock is going up following these earnings. I am not recommending that you buy it or sell it or what have you. I'm not a licensed professional, none of that stuff. So let me just get that out of the way. Not saying anything about that. Just saying that this is very good news on an earnings call. This is what you love to see, what you love to talk about. If you're an investor, if you're a shareholder, you are overjoyed at this news. Couple of UFC specifics that were called out. One, that they've acquired, 9 new media rights deal in the Asia Pac area. That is because Fox Sports Asia is essentially gone, and so the UFC had to negotiate with the regional areas that made up Fox Sports Asia, instead of just going through Fox Sports Asia. But they expect they'll actually get more money out of it because they're actually, increasing the fees per region, so that's a plus for them. Big ones are that the overall owned sports properties, which Endeavour, when you break down what owned sports properties are in Endeavour, it mostly the UFC. There is the Euro Basketball League, there is PBR, and PBR did come back with events and all of that, but still, it's a big increase. As John Nash had pointed out on Twitter, that's also in the documents from Endeavor's filing, $250 million through the first 9 months of 2021, $250 million more than owned sports properties did in 2020. Now, I don't believe that that's necessarily all the UFC. I think a couple other things coming back as COVID's kind of retreated a little bit, and certain countries have kind of just said whatever to COVID, at least certain areas of countries. I think that's a big part of it too, but I shouldn't say big. I think that's part of it. It's mostly the UFC, right? UFC is mostly driving that $250 million. Endeavour also came out and said that the UFC had the best 9 months in company history, 2021. That's also not shocking, right? When you look at how well they kind of navigated COVID and then kind of got into the swing of things, once events came back, they did very big sold out pay-per-views where people were just, craving events. but then also smartly have kept fight nights at the apex. I think that's a huge boon to them because of the costs, right? Dana White talked about when they were building the apex and before they actually hosted events there, he wanted it to be kind of, one-stop shop for everything where they could, film The Ultimate Fighter, they could film fights, they could film vignettes, do all this stuff in one area. A big part of that is cutting down costs. You don't have to drag a ring across, the country and go to a show in Wichita that may or may not do okay, and depending on who's fighting on it, right? And yeah, you can end up with a big house show, of course, but this drastically reduces cost, and probably so much so that it's worth it versus the ticket revenue that they would get in certain parts of the country, because you do in certain areas still have COVID restrictions or new COVID restrictions coming out for the US anyway. And I believe Colorado, they're talking about introducing some, depending on where you are and depending on, what COVID is doing. Some places it's like, okay, we don't care, we're just having these events, or it's kind of receded and people feel free to go out now, what have you. I mean, those areas could be potential moneymakers, but being able to cut down costs and then selling VIP experiences to the Apex Fight Nights, which, by the way, are very pricey. I mean, we're talking, some of the VIP experience I've seen are like $4,000 and up. I mean, which is crazy. But, being able to do that, you end up offsetting a lot of that cost so much that you're probably saving money. So you've got that going on. You've got these cards that are, again, maybe headlined by a really good fight, or you've got, a great main and co-main, and then the rest are not so much. A lot of newer guys, a lot of contender series, guys who are going to be lower on the payout spectrum for the UFC, making up the majority of the card. I mean, that's big too. That's huge. That cuts costs. That only drives up revenue. You can increase your overall net income one or two ways. You either cut costs or you drive up revenue. You increase selling of the product, right? So, misspoke before. Cutting costs drives net income because you are paying less. Doesn't sell more tickets necessarily. In this case, obviously it doesn't, because it's the Apex. You're not selling. Don't believe the VIP experiences, even if they're all sold out, equate to a full arena in some of these towns. But it still gives you more net income overall, which is the goal. That's the big numbers that Endeavour and all these other places want to see. So making all these changes, they've done extremely well, right? I'm not shocked that they've had their best 9 months in company history. We know from Moody's, some of the stuff that's been released through their reporting and their statements, the UFC has been doing exceedingly well. And that's why Endeavour bought them. It's to keep them afloat while they work to get their other businesses working, which it sounds like they're starting to get some traction on. So, again, looking through some of these very big highlights here, the overall message is the UFC killed it. That, in turn, allowed Endeavour to reach new heights with swinging everything around from being in the red to going into the black, and is driving Endeavor's growth at this point. Looking just through some of the statements here to make sure I didn't miss any of the other big highlights. A couple people had pointed out, and they mentioned this in their reporting, that Q3 is actually decreased revenue-wise in 2021 than 2020, but part of that is from a $25 million contract termination fee, as well as some insurance issues with PBR and stuff. Direct operating costs were a little bit higher, but nothing. I don't know. nothing that screams, oh, this could be an issue going forward, right? Um, increase in athlete compensation, production, and marketing expenses at the UFC makes it sound like people are getting paid more, and obviously production and marketing is a big deal. But there's also been an increase in PBR events held, which has driven up a lot of those increases compared to Q3 of last year, which we were still in, more pandemic times. I mean, we're still there, but not the same level we were. So it's not surprising that operating costs are up 27%. It looks like, as well as a couple other things here and there, but nothing to me that stands out that you really got to dive into. Endeavor still has a bunch of bad debt, still, is overall trying to make its way as this gigantic conglomerate, but the UFC is doing its job. It's really driving the revenue and growth that Endeavor needs in order to increase acquisitions, to continue to put on other events and build some of these other things that they've got under their, beyond sports owned property. You've got Endeavor Content, which is now shortlisting people for series and things. They're creating that ecosystem, and that costs a lot of money. UFC is the bankroll for that Endeavor ecosystem right now, and it's doing its job. That's really the big highlight. That, in turn, leads us to strategy, right? I'm a big strategy guy. It's my favorite thing to talk about. If I'm the UFC, if I'm Endeavor, I am continuing with the current strategy and possibly ramping up successful initiatives that happened in the past 3 quarters. Those initiatives, again, might include cost-cutting measures, keeping fight nights at the Apex. I would love to see the UFC on the road again. Before the pandemic hit, it was announced that the UFC was going to be here in Austin again. I've been to an Austin show here. I love it. I would love to be a part of that. I don't know that's going to happen again, at least anytime in the near future. It's just not, economically feasible, I feel like, in a lot of cases. I do feel like they'll eventually start doing some road shows just because that lack of constant shows will force fans to be like, oh, I actually want to go to something and can afford it. Cool, I'm going to go do this. But then again, it all has to make economic sense. And I feel like the Apex has really delivered with cutting production costs and doing all of that other stuff. I know we just talked about an increase in Q3 of production costs and all that, but I don't attribute that to the and all of that. And in fact, that comparison is, again, against 2020, when a completely different landscape, right? Completely different landscape of the pandemic. We were about 6 months in, no vaccine, none of that stuff. So I'm not shocked at all. But yeah, I feel like the Apex fight nights will continue. I feel like these fight nights people are complaining about, where you've got, 1 or 2 good matches at the top and then a lot of, contender series or tough guys, recently signed regional guys. I feel like that's going to continue. Because obviously there's, according to ESPN, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, still driving subscription growth, and the costs have to be cheaper. Those contender series guys are signed on pretty much the bare minimum contract, right? So not only do you have a show that a bunch of people watch, at least hardcore fans watch, to see if you make it to the UFC, so that can kind of engage you and be like, oh, I remember him from Contender Series, I remember his story, I remember all this stuff. It also keeps you essentially having now your own mini farm league to fill these fight night cards with not the best type of fights, right? Not to say that they can't put on exciting fight night cards, right? Holloway versus Rodriguez is a perfect example where on paper you had a couple of good fights and then it was kind of delivered big time. And that's happened a lot. But from a on paper perspective, these haven't been the best cards in a long time that weren't pay-per-view cards. And that's okay with the UFC. It's obviously working. They're still getting enough people watching, getting enough people paying for the experience. All this stuff, it still fulfills their deal with ESPN. Why would you stack fight night cards? The only reason I see them stacking fight night cards at this point is because you have to offer fighters so many fights within a contracted period of time that you happen to end up with a pretty stacked card because a lot of people needed to be offered fights and they accepted, so on and so forth. Scheduling, logistics. Otherwise, there's no reason to stack a fight night card at this point. The UFC has proved that. I mean, I hate to tell some of you out there that are really hoping for, fight nights of old. I think they're gone. I think they're pretty much gone because there's no reason for the UFC to do that at this point. I'm fairly certain that was a big reason that their net income and revenue went up. Overall, the net income, not overall revenue, but costs. That's what they're doing. They're cutting costs. Sponsorship deals, obviously, with crypto. ZipRecruiter, which is a weird one, but it is what it is. Though those have been killing it lately as well. I think the Venom deal has gone well because you've been able to parlay that into these other sponsorships. Reebok, I'm sure, had very big requirements, right? I doubt if we were still in the Reebok uniform era, you end up getting a Reebok uniform with a Crypto.com logo on it. Venom, I would imagine, is much more open because they're a smaller company to sponsorships with things like Crypto.com, ZipRecruiter, other sponsors that may want to have things on the logo. You have the, God, I have to look this up. The light heavyweight rankings are sponsored by something called Battle Motors. Sponsoring the rankings now. Yeah, why not? I mean, heck, if somebody's going to pay you to sponsor the rankings, why wouldn't you do it? If you're the UFC, you're going to say no, especially if it's may fit the bill. Yes, it's Battle Motors Triple C, which is, just looking this up right now on my phone because I just remembered this. Harness 75 years of severe service truck technology with the most durable, hard-working electric truck on the streets today. Okay, so it looks like a electric truck companies, battle trucks. Oh, okay, yeah, it's recycling and medium duty and all this stuff. It's big trucks, big dump trucks, recycling things. Okay, still. Right? Why not? If somebody's going to pay you for that, why wouldn't you do that? So I think those are going to continue. I think you're going to see, I don't know about the end of the year, but I would say within a year, I would imagine every rankings has some sort of sponsor, or near every rankings will have a sponsor. Maybe not women's featherweight or something like that, but I think those have been crucial to this growth, is big sponsorships. And media rights deals, of course, you're going to continue to see, as we mentioned with the Asia Pac renegotiations. That's a perfect opportunity for the UFC to negotiate individually with those regions and possibly get more money out of them individually than what they did as a whole with Fox Sports Asia. But you're looking at sponsorships and cost cutting as the main increase in revenue here, is my thought, because pay-per-view buys have been good, but we're not talking, they have been very good this year with McGregor fighting as often as he did. You definitely have good pay-per-view numbers this year, but nothing that to me jumps out as being, whoa, it's crazy numbers overall. At least from what we've seen reported, right? That's another thing. As I mentioned in the previous segment, we don't have the official numbers. I don't think we'll get official numbers unless you get McGregor leaking them or other athletes leaking them. Otherwise, you're never going to get official numbers. It's always going to be kind of off. And a lot of these cards now, we just don't hear anything and it just goes on by. And it's like, what were the numbers? Like, oh, we don't know. And that's that. And they may be good. And so maybe that's driving it too. But I really think it comes down to the sponsorship deals and these cost-cutting measures. That's what jumps out at my eye. That's, from a strategy perspective, something I'm going to continue. So I don't know if you're going to get a jersey fully decked out in like 10 different sponsors. I could see it if the UFC could work that, but regardless, expect a lot more of those two initiatives. That would be my guess, is a lot more sponsorship deals and opportunities for fighters, as well as the UFC and partnerships. And then, of course, cost-cutting measures. We've seen this now for a while, as, was pointed out at one point during Contender Series this season. I mentioned, at this point, you've got, I think I said 25%. It may actually be a little bit below that, in the 20-ish% range, because the roster is always in flux. But it's 20 to 25% of the UFC roster right now comes from Contender Series. That is very important, because that means 20 to 25% of the UFC roster is getting paid very low. Some of those guys will be on their next tier of deals, especially the ones that are kind of coming through and making a name for themselves. But a lot of those guys are getting paid on that bare minimum entry fee. That will help keep your costs very low. And as we've seen a lot of veterans. Randa Marcos just won her last fight, cut. Kama Worthy, I wouldn't call him a tried and true veteran, but cut. Liviana Souza, cut. I mean, the more fights you get at this point, if you're not winning consistently enough, even if you win your last fight, you may end up getting cut. Or it may end up being, your contract expires and you end up going somewhere else. And that's just going to keep happening. I feel like the UFC is going to keep anyone they consider as a rising star, or as someone that can really, tear through the rankings, make some noise. And they're going to cut more people faster if you're not delivering consistent wins, or letting contracts expire, rather. I think people will still be able to get to tier 2 or 3 in the contracts, right? The formula that's been devised that came out in the UFC antitrust lawsuit. I'm sure that formula has changed a little bit, but still, you fight 3 or 4 fights on the bare minimum, you get knocked up to the next level. You fight another 4 fights, you get knocked up to the next level, etc. I think getting into that, second or third contract renewal is going to be increasingly difficult, unless you are making waves like Chimaev or Adrian Yanez, guys like that are really standing out, putting on exciting fights. I think they're going to keep getting these big renewals. Other fighters, it was already hard as it was to get into those extra renewals, but now I think it's going to be even harder, because then you're going to start to cost too much, and they're just going to find somebody from the Contender Series or from looking for a fight to just slip right in. So, or Tough, right? I mean, they're keeping Tough around, yes, because ESPN Plus needs content, but also because it is a way to let in people on the bare minimum contract that they want to, right? So, I mean, you just got to be careful in terms of, if you're a new fighter, looking out for that. I would say that you've got to win. You've got to look at, if you come in through the Contender Series, you've got to perform quickly. But business-wise, yeah, the UFC is going to keep doing it. It's too lucrative for them. So lots and lots of news and things to unpack in this call. I think I've hit most of the big ones. If you think I've missed anything, or if you have any questions for me around the call, I have gone through the financial statements. I didn't want to go too into them too much, because this show is great for some of us business nerds, but I don't want to ramble all day long about it. So if you have a particular question, make sure to hit me up in a comment below on YouTube, or hit me up on Twitter at alldayoj, spelled AUGER. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have regarding that. But strategy wise, again, UFC is just going to keep doing what they're doing. Sponsorship, cost cutting. I guarantee it. What is it, Burlington Coat Factory? I think it's Burlington Coat Factory. I guarantee it. Something like that. Men's Warehouse, whatever. All right. On to the next thing. All right. Next thing to talk about. LFA has extended their deal with UFC Fight Pass through 2025. It's a big deal for a lot of reasons. If you don't remember the saga of LFA's broadcast partnership, They were with Access TV, got nixed when Access was bought by a company called Anthem, not the healthcare place. It's a different sports company. Steve Harvey was part owner. Got rid of that, and then they put on, Impact Wrestling and Combate Global. I talked to Ed Soros, president and CEO of LFA, right after everything happened in regards to that deal. He was not happy. They were kind of blindsided. There's an interview out there of me discussing it with him. He was very upset by it. Bad business is what he called it, I believe. And rightfully so, I would agree. Seems like a big old switch to just then put in some other martial arts and things. It was an interesting call. But regardless, they were blindsided by that. They were trying to figure out how to, continue their broadcast deal, because that's a huge part of their promotion. And then they ended up signing with Fight Pass. In discussing that first deal with LFA, between LFA and Fight Pass, an interesting point was brought up to me through Mr. Soros, that the LFA is then on the hook for all of their own production. So whereas Access TV did a lot of the production when they were under that deal, and it was kind of like a joint effort, really UFC Fight Pass is more the distributor. They help a little bit, but production was pretty much on LFA. That's why if you go back and look at the first couple shows when LFA did the deal with Fight Pass, it's I applaud them, especially for the crew they had. Like, man, I don't know how they were able to put together the things they did, because they were running on a skeleton crew for a bit. So shout out to them. But there were just a completely different production style than Access, and it was definitely a little bit more homemade in the first show, getting your bearings, and then from there they've only continued to grow, and now they're in a good spot. But it shifted the onus of production onto the promotion fully, and is just a distribution. That is definitely a con of a Fight Pass deal, is, you have to handle the graphics, the, vignettes, the different kind of camera work, all of that. And you have to adhere to the UFC's rules, Fight Pass's rules, but, most of the work is on you to put on the show, to produce. That is trying, I feel like, for smaller promotions. Again, shout out to LFA. They've been able to do it very well at this point. And even when they had to go through their craziness of switching broadcast partners the way they did, they handled it beautifully. It's just something that any smaller promotion has to take into account when looking at doing a deal with Fight Pass. I think that's kind of a big con with the Fight Pass deals. The pros are obviously, Fight Pass is a recognized name for the hardcores. I know a lot of people that have Fight Pass because of the library in and of itself. I had Fight Pass for a while. I occasionally re-sign up when I want to go through and do all the library stuff. I'm not an analyst, so I'm not looking at, a ton of old fights. If I get nostalgic and I'm like, I want to watch Pride, like, I will subscribe for a month or two and then let it go. And I love watching, LFA and the other promotion Fight Pass, but it's just, for me, it is what it is. But I understand why a lot of people have Fight Pass and why it's a big deal. Another con to that, though, is that if you're on something like Access TV, or you're on a channel, even if it's a reduced cable channel, you have the ability to attract newer audiences easier, right? Somebody that maybe is kind of thinking about watching a LFA card is not going to pay for a UFC Fight Pass subscription just to watch a card and then decide if they like it or not. That was part of the beauty of being on cable or on a bigger streaming service. It is, especially cable, flipping channel surfing, man, it feels so old saying that now because it's just a thing of the past, but you used to channel surf, right? you didn't have the option of, oh, here's these commercials, I want to look at something else, or oh, there's nothing good on my favorite channels, I wonder what else is on. You just looked, and occasionally you might stumble across something like LFA and be like, oh, this is actually cool. I think that's actually how I watched my very first LFA event forever ago. It's a thing of the past now, though. And so you lose kind of potential to drag some people in, but still, I mean, you're getting what I assume is good money because, they're not going to do bad business deals over at LFA. They're too important. They're too big as a feeder league for UFC, Bellator, and one PFL. They're not going to do bad deals in general. So I know they do their due diligence over there. So I'm sure they're getting good money. It allows them to be on a platform that they know combat sports enthusiasts who are bigger, like UFC fans or Bellator fans, bigger promotions. They might find them, which it's more likely you're going to convert somebody like LFA, right? So that is good for them. But there are pros and cons to it. Through 2025, I mean, that locks you in for another 4 years. I think it's the right call. I think it's a good deal for them. But, it's something where I'll be very curious to see where they go in 2025 and beyond. Because LFA is the biggest feeder. They're not. I've been specifically told by them once to never call them a regional promotion, and I agree. They travel enough, right? They go all over the world. They're not a regional promotion. They're a upper level than that, but they are in that space of being kind of the minor leagues, the premier minor leagues for bigger promotions. They're kind of the AAA, one of the AAAs. There are a couple, right? But they're a big AAA league out there, along with Invictus, couple others, but really they're one of the biggest. So I will be curious to see what they do in regards to media rights beyond 2025, especially if Fight Pass subscriptions, depending on how they do over the next 4 years, with more and more content going over to ESPN Plus, because that's what ESPN is really craving. But I think right now it's a great deal. It makes a lot of sense for them. Allows them to, keep stability throughout the next 4 years and to bounce back from the pandemic without having to add another wrinkle of, oh, now we've got to find another, broadcast provider, all of that. So some pros and cons to it, but I like the deal a lot. Happy for them. And yeah, I hope they continue to put on great shows and expand their reach, because they're doing great work out there. So shout out to LFA. Next thing I want to talk about here is the Professional Fighters League and Legends Global Merchandise have signed an exclusive multi-year deal that will see Legends produce PFL branded products and memorabilia. Legends is also the exclusive global e-commerce provider for PFL. So if you look at what Legends really is, it's a way for PFL to sell their merchandise, so shirts, sweatshirts, hats, all that fun stuff. They entered into a strategic partnership earlier in the year. I had talked about it on a previous Fight Business podcast. Now they are, going full on into a ownership stake, where Legends is actually purchasing an ownership stake of the PFL and will be the exclusive provider for all of the apparel. They talk about VIP experiences here. I'm not sure exactly what that is. Don't necessarily think it's like the UFC VIP experience, but it could be, where you have like special seating at events, or different fighter meet and greets and all that stuff. There's definitely elements to it, I'm sure, that are similar, but it's a big deal because in this PR piece, which was sent out on November 4th, so a bit ago, but I apologize, I was off a week. You have Dave Moroknik, the president of Legends Global Merchandise, stating, "This is a very strategic initiative for us, as Legends Global Merchandise is the leader in e-commerce and specifically MMA e-commerce and merchandising. We are thrilled to be associated with the PFL as we expand our partnership throughout the entire Legends organization. We have set our sights on working closely with the PFL to deliver the best merchandise with the best customer experience to the fans of the PFL." The fact that he calls it a strategic initiative in the PR piece leads me to believe that this is a big deal where they're putting a lot of their, maybe not all, I don't think all, but they're putting a lot of their eggs in their basket, in this basket, right? And they must have seen enough numbers and enough, behind the scenes type of graphs and presentations, and I'm sure they had discussions with all of that, where they thought it made sense to get this deal done and to purchase a stake in the PFL. That's interesting based on what we've talked about before, right? Ratings for the PFL Championship were very bad for Season 3. A lot of people and hardcore fans like the PFL. I love the PFL's format. I was excited to see them sign other people. I feel like a lot of hardcore fans, MMA fans, were also excited to see Pettis and Verdum and some more notable, bigger names in the PFL this past season. Rory, I hope next season it grows even bigger. But, from a numbers perspective, hasn't been the best. Had to do a lot of funding. Ratings haven't been great. But as I said before, following the third season championship of the PFL, if you can convince people to give you money, you can just keep on rolling until you're profitable, right? The goal of a startup company is to, yes, turn profitable, but ultimately it's to keep the money flowing until you're profitable. If you are very good at getting money to flow in, or you have certain metrics and things that show to a long-term growth potential / future horizon, you can convince people to give you money for a long time. And that's what the PFL has to do right now, is continue that funding coming on until they can actually turn the corner and be in the black. This is part of that. Selling equity is, never a great sign, but not necessarily a bad sign. A lot of companies have to sell equity in order to reach that next level. Almost all startups do. At this stage, being 3 seasons in, the partnership to actually get merchandise out as well, I think, makes sense. From the PFL perspective, where you can give away a bit of equity. You also have now a bunch of merchandising opportunities and somebody handling all of that. But it depends on how much equity, right? We don't know that. It does not say in the press release what we're looking at percentage-wise. I would love to know that number. I've done some digging. I have not been able to find it. I'm going to keep reaching out to sources and seeing if I hear anything on that. But, it's interesting because if, again, I'm looking from the outside in, I'm very hesitant to invest in the PFL. So either A, you've got somebody that's really good at selling, right? Don Davis is going out there and killing it at these presentations and these boardroom discussions. You've got metrics behind the scenes that things are not as bad as they appear. Trust me, we're all good. Here's all the metrics that prove that. And investors are seeing that and saying, you know what? Okay, we're in. Or you just got, people that are making not the best decisions, which happens a lot in business, right? Startups fail all the time. Partnerships happen all the time that end up not well. I've worked for one company in particular that acquired another company, said it was going to be this groundbreaking thing. 3 years later, nothing came of it. Spun off and sold the company for a much reduced price. It happens. It happens. Business is not nearly, how do I want to phrase this? It's important to note that in the business world, there are not nearly as many smart people in the room as both you and I think and themselves think. That's just how it is. I've seen that from the outside in. So I'm not saying that's the case here, but from the outside, I am very wary of, looking at. Yeah, I just, there's no other way to put it. From the outside looking in, to me, it's red flag city right now. But internally, maybe there's things that I'm not aware of. And Legend saw enough that, hey, we're in, or it's a very small stake, who knows? But it's good for the PFL, that's for sure, because they need to keep the money coming in, especially if they want to try and entice bringing back Kayla Harrison, who, if they lose her in free agency, that's going to be a big blow. They've got to get other big name fighters. They've got to get a media rights deal with ESPN seemingly not renewing them. They need to be, firing on all fronts here. So big deal in that regard. But I wouldn't hold my breath on it, being a sign of, oh, they're big things coming and they're actually killing it behind the scenes. I don't know about that. But, we'll see what happens. And great job on the PFL for securing that. And we'll see what comes of season 4 and what kind of merchandising and events and experiences they're offering. It'll be interesting, that's for sure. Last thing to cover for this episode is something I alluded to earlier, which is apparently ESPN is very happy with the UFC's work on driving ESPN Plus subscriptions. You've got around 14.9 million ESPN Plus subscriptions right now. I believe it was a tweet from the Sports Business Journal. I can't find it specifically here. But there are a couple of things out there where internally it seems like ESPN is very happy with the UFC and what they've done to drive ESPN Plus numbers, which is really the whole point of their partnership, right? You had the big sign up when UFC first went over to ESPN Plus, where you got a ton of people to sign up for the service for that Cejudo Dillashaw fight. Was a big driver there. That eventually led to the exclusive pay-per-view agreement between ESPN and the UFC, which, now is producing ridiculous money bags for the UFC and quite possibly ESPN as well, if the UFC is really driving all this ESPN Plus subscriber growth. And, it made sense to have this deal and to even go the pay-per-view route for a lot of reasons. But to be at this stage of the deal and have your broadcast partner be happy with what you're doing and having it kind of be leaked that way in news reports and through sources saying like, yeah, people are very happy with UFC. ESPN people are very happy with UFC. That's, you can't get better than that, because you're talking about a huge deal for the UFC that allowed them to go from this crazy variable type model where the variable revenue needed to sell pay-per-views. If you have a bad year or stars get hurt, not a good time. You have people like Conor McGregor and Brock Lesnar really having leverage over you and being able to drive harder bargains because you are dependent on them for the pay-per-view buys. That is all pretty much gone now, and you are instead in this era of really fixed, mostly fixed revenue streams at your core, with some variable revenue coming in if pay-per-view buys exceed a certain amount and some other deals here and there. I mean, it transformed the business, right? It's really what allowed the UFC to have the best 9 months they've ever had and to reach these new heights. There's a reason why they became so profitable that Endeavour pulled the trigger on fully purchasing the remaining UFC shares. If they hadn't, UFC would be a public company. I guarantee it. I guarantee KKR or Silver Lake would have pulled the trigger and said, nope, we want shares in the UFC. We're going to pull these provisions that we have in the initial deal that was made between Endeavour, KKR, and Silver Lake when Endeavour took a majority stake in the UFC. And we're going to pull that trigger, and UFC is going to go public. And they'd be killing it right now. They would be doing so well right now. It wouldn't even be funny. I don't know what entry point the stock price would have been put at. I would have bought at the opening easily, especially with what they're doing now. But you're now in an era where losing this model would be very bad. And this is the first deal of its kind between the UFC and a real pay-per-view provider, right? Exclusive pay-per-view provider. So making ESPN happy is of paramount importance for the promotion. Making sure that at the end of 7 years, ESPN is not saying, hey, yeah, that was great and all. We had some highs, we had some lows, but we're going to go somewhere else, is very big. Because if the UFC had to revert back to the multiple outlet pay-per-view model again, where, again, you've got all of these different people getting cuts, pay-per-view numbers are being reported pretty much every event, all of that, that's a very bad thing for them at this point. It takes away a lot of that fixed revenue. You end up in a spot where you would need all of those big stars again. UFC never wants to go back to that. And they ideally want to be at a spot where, again, ESPN picks them up, or they've done such a good job that somebody else offers to pick them up and be exclusive. That's the goal of that deal. So to hear ESPN say that, yes, it's driving our subscriber growth, it's doing all that, that's music to the UFC's ears. You couple that with the week they've had, I mean, I'm sure they're having crazy parties over at UFC headquarters right now. I would be, I mean, good Lord. Best 9 months in company history. ESPN extremely happy with you. What more can you want? So again, that points to, I hate to tell some of you guys this, the changes you want to see, more merit-based matchups, more stacked fight night cards, all this other stuff. It's not happening. A lot of people have asked me, what's the business decision behind not doing Carla Esparza versus Rose Namajunas now that Rose has beaten Weili again? Well, clearly there's something metric-wise that they have with Esparza where she's not a big draw. And the fact that Dana says, hey, we have somebody else, is somebody else must be drawing well. Yes, he's hiding it behind the smoke screen of, oh, well, she sat out, you don't sit out. But we've seen multiple times people sit out and then get rewarded for it. Tyron Woodley, Stipe, the list goes on and on, right? So expect more of that. Expect more Leon Edwards to win 9 fights. Chimaev, arguably, he fights Burns next, and then he gets a title shot. This era is not going away anytime soon. It has been too lucrative for them. This is a prime example of a strategy working, giving you an already greater competitive edge than you had before. There's no way that you do not continue the majority of the big initiatives. They'll tweak it. You always do. Market changes, and strategies run their course, and you've got to, reconfigure things. But right now, you're running with this, and you're not looking back. So, don't expect any of those big changes in that regard. Don't expect ESPN to air grievances and, ask for changes and say, hey, UFC, look, we need you to maybe switch this up a little bit, and kind of use their leverage as their partner to say, maybe we change a couple things. Nope. ESPN loves it. So none of that's happening. Sorry to tell you guys that. But from a strategic perspective, again, killing it on all cylinders, and you're going to run with this until you have indicators that flash and say, hey, we've got to change. Otherwise, you're setting this on cruise control, and you're, again, throwing extravagant parties at UFC headquarters, I would imagine. So, all right, guys, that is it for this episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Appreciate you guys watching on YouTube. Make sure you hit the like, subscribe, bell notification button. If you're listening on Anchor, appreciate, or any other podcast network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any of that. I appreciate that as well. Love you guys for it. Sorry I missed last week. Had some family stuff come up and was a whole thing, but we're good. All good vibes, all good times. Expect next week's episode to be out on time. Everything to go, according to plan. Fingers crossed, though, now that I say that, who knows. But I appreciate and love you guys. If you have any questions about anything business-wise, hit me up at All Day OJ or drop some comments. I'll be happy to talk to you. And until next time, get that money.